You are listening to Small Farms Radio.
Welcome to Small Farms Radio. I'm your host, Jamie Johnson. Today we're going to talk with Professor Rebecca Nelson about the merits of using urine as a fertilizer. I've known Rebecca for over 25 years, having grown up with her son. And as long as I've known her, she's taken on big problems with a practicality and an enthusiasm that is contagious. So when I ran into her recently and found out that she was working on rebranding urine as a fertilizer, I knew I had to bring her on the show. Welcome to the show, Rebecca. Let's start off with just a little bit about your background.
I'm Rebecca Nelson. I'm a professor at Cornell University in the School of Integrative Plant Science and also the newly formed School of the Environment and Sustainable Development. And I am circular bionutrient economy research, and I studied biology in college and got a PhD in zoology, only to turn around to become a plant pathologist, in spite of the fact that plant pathologists need to know about plants and microbes, and neither one of them is in the animal kingdom, so that was a little bit of a challenge getting going. But anyway, I got a PhD in zoology at the University of Washington, Seattle, and flew out from there to the Philippines, where I took a job as a plant pathologist at the International Rice Research Institute. Was there for 8 years, looking at a couple of big rice diseases, having a great time, and then moved to Peru, where we spent 5 years I was at the International Potato Center, and then for there came here. And for the first 20 years, I was at Cornell. My lab was working on maize genetics, looking at how plants defend themselves against diseases, which is what I was doing all along on rice and potatoes, and it's like always trying to understand how plants can better put up with pathogens attacking them without going down too hard. But then after 20 years of that, I was also, during those first couple of decades here at Cornell, was working for the McKnight Foundation, supporting their international crop research program. So that kind of gave me a chance to see what was going on in lots of places around the world. And something that really excited me was these farmers in back beyond Niger who are using urine as a fertilizer. And that both struck me as kind of a cool out-of-the-box thing. And the thing I was most sort of excited about in corn genetics of disease resistance was a resistance to these mycotoxins. So these fungal pathogens, which are kind of generalist pathogens, but they produce these toxic metabolites. About 65% or something like that are measurably toxic, and a quarter of the foodstuffs are like seriously toxic from these fungal metabolites like aflatoxin, fumonisin, and the hundreds of other fungal toxins. So I got real excited. I was really hell-bent on trying to prevent the public from being poisoned by these toxins, and then seeing how these farmers in West Africa were using excreta as fertilizer, I was like, oh, the best way for a plant to be less vulnerable to these toxic metabolites is to be healthy. So if the soil's healthy, the plants are healthy. If the plants are healthy, they don't get contaminated, so the people are healthy. So you can get better quality and quantity of food if the soil is healthy. So I sort of like, okay, and how can people build soil health without breaking the bank or depending on fossil fuels for their source of fertilizer? I was, circular economy, dang it. So that's how I got into the whole pea cycling thing. And I've been having a lot of fun with it. So that's, in brief, how I got to that thing. Partly soil health for plant health, for human health, and partly just for how can you can't run a linear economy of nutrients forever. Making nutrients from fossil fuels and from a few mines in the world, and then dumping after the food comes through our bodies, dumping it into the lake. That only works for a couple of decades. After that, it gets pretty gross.
Gonna have to come up with some other ideas.
Yeah, Plan B. Yeah, which is I'm calling circular economy kind of old but bold. Like people have always used excreta for fertilizers. Not really. It's not like it hasn't been done. It's been done, most places for much of time, but it's just this last couple of generations where we had this kind of, big fossil fuel-based economy going, and this kind of hygienist mentality. Everything should be squeaky clean, brand new, and throw it in the landfill as soon as it looks a little worn. Between that kind of extractive mindset and this kind of squeaky clean mindset, we kind of went this way. But then I think we're just starting to realize that as the downsides of that paradigm are becoming quite clear. So I think circular economy is starting to look pretty good again.
You're talking about circular economies. Can you just, if someone doesn't know what that is, tell us what it is?
Yeah, the idea of circular economy is sometimes expressed like the waste from any one person, place, or thing becomes the food for another. So in a forest, if something dies or it drops a leaf or whatever, some other organism is going to pick it up and use that to feed itself. And so in the linear economy, which is the sort of juxtaposition, you're comparing yourself with this take, make, waste paradigm, which we do now. You mine it, you make it, you use it, and you chuck it in the landfill. So that's kind of what we're up against. In the case of food, we do waste 40% of our food, and most of that goes into landfill, and that produces a ton of methane. It's pretty bad. And what the heck, we're all kinds of valuable things. Once you jumble together, they're not valuable anymore, and they have a huge carbon footprint as they go bad. So the circular economy. In the food system, so a circular food system, you try to keep those nutrients in circulation as long as you can. You don't, you keep them out of the lake for as long as you can. So you, for example, when you have food waste, you can feed it to black soldier flies, have those flies feed your chickens. You try to keep those nutrients moving around. And whatever nutrients come through our bodies, you can, your excreta can be used as fertilizer. They can be used to make, a lot of waste, including excreta, can be used to make energy with anaerobic digestion. So you have sort of a hierarchy of uses typically for any waste management paradigm. So for food, the highest use is if you have leftover food, feed it to people, hungry people, or failing that, feed it to hungry animals. Failing that, you've got, you might extract some valuable biochemistry out of it. In some cases, like coffee grounds or orange peels, you can make valuable industrial products from them. You can make compost, goes back into the soil. You can anaerobically digest, use it to make energy, and then use the digestate as a fertilizer source or a soil amendment. And then you're really putting what are now the go-to moves of incineration or landfilling as the really last resorts.
So there are all these creative ways to recycle nutrients, and you're looking into one of them, and you picked pea cycling, which is something we've been mentioning. Could you just explain to people what the basics of pea cycling?
So urine, whatever you eat, it gets partitioned into your urine, your poop, your breath. So carbon comes out of in your CO2, and maybe a little bit in your sweat. So, but the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are mostly coming out in your urine. So most of your NPK, which is what you'd buy in a bag of fertilizer, is coming out in your pee. And so that's why it makes such a good fertilizer. And now for the micronutrients, magnesium, calcium, iron, those mostly go into the poop. Mm-hmm. So you might want to keep your eye on the calcium if you have a high calcium requiring crop. Like for my tomatoes, I kind of put some eggshells in the mix because I don't feel like the pea has quite enough calcium for those guys. And in that grows you go gardening medium. But when we have benchmarked urine against synthetic fertilizer, we benchmark well. And what
does that mean? Just direct comparison between the two?
Yeah. You have to know how strong your pee is, and it varies a lot depending on how much the person drinks in the way of water. So pee can, you can look at the color. Well, as it ages, the color kind of changes the pee. But coming right out of the gate, depending on how much a person is, hydrated, you're going to have between 3 and 9 milligrams per liter. Is that right? Grams per liter. Grams per liter. Get that right, Nelson? Of nitrogen. So it's less than 1% nitrogen, and pushing a 1% nitrogen.
So in a direct substitute with synthetic fertilizer,
yeah,
it performs about the same.
Yeah,
and sometimes better.
Yeah, we got a lot of data that says that, and that's not a surprise. So when my colleague at the golf course was delighted and sort of seemed surprised about how well the pea treatment performed on the golf course grass, I was not surprised, I admit. I was like, I would have had to have screwed up real bad for that not to be true. So,
that's funny. And the other thing I'd like you to talk about is, you mentioned these sort of different ways of thinking, different paradigms. One's sort of like squeaky clean, like kill all the microbes, keep a sterile environment. Another one is maybe more about diversity and creating a good, healthy microbiome. And I think pea cycling is a very interesting choice between those two. It's a very intentional choice because it viscerally gets people thinking about these things. And I'd love for you to talk about that too.
Well, I think you put it pretty well, Jamie, honestly. It appealed to me for a number of reasons, and you have sort of touched on that basic idea. Point one, it implicates all of us. And if you sum all of us up, it's a lot of people. So, depending on how wasteful your food system is, that's either a big or a small contribution to what you could do to help agriculture. In Africa, where they don't use that much fertilizer and they don't waste that as much, you can replace all of your fertilizer use that you have now, both for nitrogen and phosphorus, with urine nutrients. So there's the fact of it being so inclusive and so important in really low resource contexts where people don't have good access to fertilizer. The accessibility of it is really attractive to me, and that's sort of what I care. That's what motivates me the most. That's what really is driving me, is the feeling that for a large fraction of humanity, for example, 40% of humanity apparently lives in peri-urban areas, actual slums, at least 1.1 billion people, and that's known to be a definitely underestimate when anybody's looked closely. So just so many people are living under, they lack sanitation and other services. They lack food security, dignity, a clean environment, a healthy place to raise their kids. And I just feel like, it might be considered gross to talk about excreta, but it's even grosser not to, and just like having people being awash in unmanaged human waste is just not okay from any perspective. And it's polluting the aquatic environment. Anywhere where people and water come together, the water's getting destroyed. And that's actually a source of food and livelihood and like recreation and a place to splash around. Gross if it's full of, excreta nutrients. It's also therefore full of harmful algal blooms, which can be really toxic. So there's just a bunch of what we call co-benefits if you manage sanitation, sort of redirect the nutrients that are now serving as pollutants of the aquatic environment or of the neighborhood, redirect them into agriculture as fertilizers. There's a lot of good things that can come of that. Clean up the neighborhood. You can make money if you're making fertilizer. You can protect the aquatic environment by not dumping nutrients into it. So the sanitation, the human health benefits of sanitation, which are huge, obviously, the money of livelihoods that come from providing these services, the agricultural benefits, they add up, and I'm particularly motivated by the fact that the people who most could benefit from this circular sanitation or ecological sanitation are the people who don't have sanitation now, by definition, some of the most ill-served populations, like slum dwellers and people that don't have services. Like, it's easy for them to get it. Now, for us, we're locked in on pretty good sanitation. Once you put millions or billions of dollars, like one wastewater treatment plant in New York City costs $5 billion, and they're looking at putting up a new $10 billion one. Never mind that with sea level rise, that infrastructure is, I think, up against some serious doom. You can't have sea level rise. You put wastewater treatment plants at the lowest point in a watershed because of gravity-fed system. You fast forward some sea level rise. What's going to happen? It's going to get eaten out by salt water, and then it's going to get washed away by rising tides. So I think we really have to get out ahead of that reality, which is predictably coming to us. And so, for now we're kind of goofing off, and you and I are both appreciators of the fancy porta potty. But that's really a fun intermediate step to trying to transition people to resource recovering sanitation. So it's kind of silly and artistic and fun here because like that's where we're at. People aren't ready to have a serious conversation about it. But I think they will in due course, and we better be ready for when that conversation gets serious. When these climate change related infrastructure failures, or even just infrastructure getting outdated, either you're going to put in many, many millions of dollars, or you're going to look at plan B. So I think plan B needs to be getting going. And, we're not ready yet. There's a lot of stuff, there's plenty of ideas, and there's a worldwide innovation around this subject. It's not just me.
So you talked a little bit about the context here. Can you talk more specifically about pea cycling and circular economies in New York State and how you could see some tie-ins for farmers?
Yeah, so an example of a kind of role model for how that could work might come from the Rich Earth Institute in Brattleboro, Vermont, where they have a community pea cycling operation going. It's the oldest and biggest community pea cycling operation in the States, which frankly doesn't say that much because they're more or less the only game in town. But they provide free fertilizer to the farmers around them. And those farmers are like, hey, bring that on. If you're within a certain distance, let's say 20 kilometers or something like that, it's cost effective just to use it straight as a fertilizer. So human urine is a great fertilizer as is, And so they use it there on their hay farms, for example. So they just drag sort of they've got a tank and it's distributing pea out the back of the tractor, and great fertilizer. Depending on, the rainfall situation, you might have to dilute it or not, depending on how moist the soil is. But so that's one thing, is free fertilizer. Another, so there's different ways I claim you can store the nutrients from urine. One is in a tank. You can, so we could collect it in places that are high traffic, like think of rest stops on a highway. Everyone comes in and delivers and leaves. If you can stack that stuff up and then just deliver that within the radius that you can cost effectively deliver those nutrients to farmers around, to me that would make sense. Or you can make pea-powered compost. So if you have crop residues from those neighboring farms, you can also store the nutrients from the pea together with the carbon-rich materials from their straw, their wheat, their maize stover, what have you, even leaves, or can be composted. So if something carbon-rich is it's pretty straightforward to mix the nutrients from pea with the carbon materials, and it turns into a nice compost. The trick here, Jamie, is that urine comes out at around a neutral pH, and it's quite clean. But the ambient microbes of the world have this urease, sort of quite, omnipresent urease enzyme that's pretty effective, and it'll cleave your urea, which is 2 N's and a C, into 2 ammonium ions, which then the C part gives you carbonates, which raise the pH, and you're going to now have ammonia and H3, which is volatile. So you're losing it stinks. You're sending out ammonia into the air, which is part of a particulate pollution problem. You've just lost your nitrogen, otherwise, you've just kind of lost the nitrogen battle if you just leave it alone. So you got to either drive the pH down, keep it as ammonium, keep that proton on there, won't go anywhere. That liquid looks real nice because you don't have this, your phosphorus goes out as struvite and kind of nasty scaly looking problem at neutral. Low pH, you'll have a nice amber liquid that, will stay as either urea or ammonium, or you take the pH real high with this kind of some alkaline agent. I use calcium hydroxide. So at either one of those extremes, you can dry that and have a dry fertilizer. Mm-hmm. And so depending on your soil, you might want to dial a pH up or down.
So that's the scientific chemistry explanation. What does this mean, like practically? Like if I have a small farm and I want to save my own urine, what am I dealing with?
So depending on your dynamics, like if you're dealing with your household urine, my sister, who's a farmer in South Dakota, she just got a kind of a straw bale that was not looking good, one of her big round bales that she didn't think had a bright future, and she just dumped the family pea on that, compost that in the bale. And I've done it.
And so then what does that do to the bale? It makes it nitrogen rich?
Yeah, just when you want the carbon-nitrogen ratio to be within a certain zone to get composting to work. Mm-hmm. So once you get that C to N ratio right, that turns that bale into a nice compost. We have done a lot of work with something we call grow as you go gardening method. And the idea there, I kind of started from the position of straw bale gardening, where you basically do that. You garden in a straw bale, you put fertilizer on there, and you just grow the plants in the straw bale. I did that for a few years, and I'm like, this is pretty mediocre, because it kind of eats out the straw bale as it composts. And so we started using the straw bales to frame a raised bed, and then you put all your junk carbon, your leaves that you have around, weeds, last year's straw bale, if you've done this before, goes into the bed, and then we just garden and fertigate essentially with urine during the season. And that's been working really well for us.
So if you capture your pee and you leave it exposed to the air, there's like a chemical reaction going on there. So it sort of degrades with time. And I think it would be good if you could just explain like just the basic chemical properties of urine and why it's good for plants.
Yeah, so when you eat food, let's say you have you've got proteins and carbohydrates. These are carbon and nitrogen and other elements in complex forms that plants have stitched together using sunlight as the energy source, right? So the plant's taking the CO2, they're going to stitch that together into a carbohydrate or a lipid, or putting the nitrogen into the mix of proteins and DNA and stuff. And so now you're going to eat that, and you'll break it down to get the energy and the nutrients out of what the plant has dished to you. And then when you're done with it, it's back in simple form, suitable for plants. So they feed us, and we can feed them, kind of similar to how they breathe out oxygen, which is kind of waste product for them. And we breathe that in, that's what we need. And we breathe out CO2 is what they need to take in. So they breathe for us, we breathe for them. They feed us, and we can feed them too. So the nutrients come out of us in plant-friendly form. You don't need to, like with manure or poop, there's enough there that microbes still have to break that down to turn it into something that's okay for the plants. Not so for pee. It's ready to go right out of the gate. You just need to dilute it to where it's not just too strong for the plants. So yeah, you can water your garden, you can water your crops, you can compost with it, you can make a fertilizer if you want to store it. So kind of on the individual farm or person level, yeah, any of those three, water your crops, enrich your compost, do this grow as you go gardening. Those are all things you can do with a family type of pea. If you want to go bigger on the community scale, or you want to get enough that you could grow actual commercial level crops with it, you're going to need more than your family's amount. Because one person's product per day will fertilize 1 square meter of like wheat field or whatever of crop, which if you do the math is not that much, so that's 365, square meters of crop, which is not that much, if you're really farming, so per person. So if you want to so that's 3-point-something kg of nitrogen per person per year. It's a lot, but it's not that much. So if you want to go big into it as a farm or as a society, you're going to have to redirect from like more people than your family, So that's where we get into sort of these community pea cycling or institutional pea cycling, or God willing, real municipal level resource recovery, so you can get out of we have projects that are trying to get it out of a wastewater treatment plant. But if that's what you're doing, I think most of your listeners will probably be worried already about these forever chemicals, So if you're putting biosolids or any other stuff coming out of a wastewater treatment plant, you got to worry about the industrial contaminants in that stuff. So that's become a huge issue.
And that's not an issue with pee?
It's not like there's nothing at this point that's really absent PFAS. PFAS is in the rainwater. It's in your shampoo. It's in your tampon or whatever. So like, it's not like you don't have any, but it really matters how much. And so this is, I think our body product, unless you're living in an area that's hideously contaminated, is pretty, it's, rainwater level. Hopefully, it's not going to be too much worse than that, or I really worry. So generally speaking, in our projects, we are looking at that. And the Rich Earth Institute's doing some mass balance analysis to just see like how much safer, your field gets a lot of rainwater. If you're putting in some fertilizer from pea, it's not like it's going to be a big source of those kinds of contaminants. People are always legitimately worried about drug residues or hormones, stuff like that. And, the evidence available to date is that it would take, you don't get that much accumulating in food. But there's a lot of drugs out there and you never know. But the data to date doesn't make me too worried about that.
And so that sort of, I feel like people's natural reaction to hearing that you're putting pea on plants that you're going to eat is concerns about food safety. Can you talk about that?
I think it's a natural reaction, and I think it's respectable always to be concerned about food safety, so I don't want to trivialize people's concerns. Yet, I think we want to distinguish kind of an aesthetics or ick reaction from what is the actual technical concern? Is there one? So what could it be? It could be microbial, or it could be chemical. Those are kind of my two concern categories with regard to. And, urine is supposed to be, quote, sterile. Well, nothing sterile was been out in the world. It's going to pick up something. And if it's picked up some fecal contamination, then it could have some of the associated concerns that you'd have with poop, which are serious. Like poop is hazardous material, And you can't necessarily rule out that there's been some fecal contamination, maybe. So we do pasteurize, or this pH 13, collecting it on lime, either by pH or by pasteurization, so heat or pH or some other trick you can use to, or even if you age urine, the pH will rise high enough that the World Health Org will declare it safe from a microbial standpoint if you store it. So you're mentioning, if you leave it open, it'll lose its nitrogen. But if you close the jug, it's not going to do that. So you close your jug and you leave it sealed for, depending on the temperature, 2 to 6 months. And then just that natural hydrolysis and pH rise that I mentioned earlier, that will sterilize it enough that the World Health Org says it's cool.
So that's something that will just happen naturally if you just pee in a bottle and close it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can either age it out that way, or you can, as I said, add something to jack the pH up or down. Or you can, we use a heat recovering pasteurizer that the Rich Earth guys have made. And so that's what we use for our experiments. But I'm, on my own dime, if I'm using it on my own garden, I'm not worried about any of these problems. I just use it. And the World Health Org says if you're just using it yourself, you don't, you can be pretty easygoing because I don't think the concerns are very significant. But I kind of like, in my Grow As You Go gardening, if I put the pea that season on the framing bales, then I'm composting the bales that are the frame of my raised bed. And then I reframe it with fresh bales come spring, and the composted material that's my old bales goes in to refresh my garden. So there's sort of a dynamic to this Grow As You Go method that involves, not using the urine directly on the garden that year necessarily, but producing a very nice rich compost which goes on top of last year's garden to replenish the material.
Or using it on crops that aren't food producing. So one of the interviews we did recently was with Yellow Bud Nursery in Massachusetts, and they get pea from the Rich Earth Institute, and they're just growing agroforestry tree seedlings.
Perfect, yeah. And weirdly or otherwise, or surprisingly or otherwise, the golf industry seems to, I can't speak as if it's the industry as a whole, but when I gave a talk a few years ago at the Crop Society of America, or Tri-Society of Crop Agronomy and Soil Science, about this kind of idea, I was contacted by various parties. And one of them was a guy who's writing a golfing blog. And so he put out a couple of blog posts about pea cycling, but the golf course the people there were interested, and so we've got an experiment going that's looking great. And their concern is not just golf courses, but all of the grass environments, including lawns and cemeteries and sports fields and all kinds of other spaces like that. You even have, median strips on all the highways, et cetera, et cetera. And you're sort of highlighting some of them, non-food fertilized landscape niches. Why not? I mean, Carl Schimenti is our collaborator on the golf course, and he reported that, the urine treatment looks just as good as the urea treatment and way better than the water treatment on the golf course. And so, these things take time to play out, but he's not thinking of the Cornell golf course. He's thinking of Long Island, where they have a legitimate problem of nitrogen going into the Long Island Sound, and it's like a really problem. So I kind of think in terms of how change is going to happen. Yeah, you can have good ideas. Everybody's got a good idea, big deal. When you're really addressing a pain point, that's when things might change. And they've got a pain point on Long Island Sound and those niches where there's sort of a problem, either that the septic systems actually don't fulfill the technical requirements of septic working, and so you've got a lot of nutrients going into the water body. Those are situations where people are forced to get creative and they start looking at these source separating systems. And I'm seeing that there's some interesting kind of change in those contexts. So Carl, our collaborator at the Cornell golf course, is really thinking about how institutions and households in a place like Long Island might be early adopters for something like that, where they just have a problem with nitrogen runoff, and then they'd be willing to look at more creative ways forward.
Well, yeah, bringing it back to farms, I do think there is a bit of a pain point where you're running on very tight margins, and you need a strategy to improve your soil health. And often, like sort of the traditional way of doing that is to apply fertilizer that you buy. And so, I don't know, this past week I went and filmed a video for a U-Pick orchard, but that's a place where people are coming in and paying for an experience to be there. And so you have, a bit more of a source for urine there, and then you're fertilizing trees. So
I think that's great. Yeah, we were approached by a farm in the Hudson Valley that's a very public-facing farm, not dominantly an orchard necessarily, but they definitely do a lot of work with workshops and the public in various ways. And so they had a sanitation problem, and they really wanted to have source separating sanitation that they could do resource recovery from. So we came up with this Lou with a View project that's kind of, artistic and performative, kind of a sculptural toilet at the very top of the hill looking out of the farm. And then the idea would be to have a more workman-like, just sanitation, resource recovering sanitation system for all the event spaces. And yeah, be able to use it for the trees and the anything that's not a touchy subject with the public, and maybe go easy, like start with the least controversial and get people used to the idea. And even just by having people use a source separating toilet, and like the one that you had built to the listener, Jamie here built a beautiful source separating toilet for events. So we were collecting pee with sort of a low end pop up tent system, off the shelf shower tent kind of deal, for an event in Ithaca. And Jamie was shaking his head like, no, you need to do better. And I was very, very grateful that he built this beautiful trailer that was good for a 2-seater. So we used that at the recent Porch Fest event, and it's just so much nicer. It's just way, way, way nicer user experience. And I think just even that, giving people a chance to think about it and learn about it, is really valuable as a step toward getting people to accept. And then, there's a long process realistically if we really want to transform society. So, what are the regulatory barriers, the technical ones, the operational ones? So really think about how a farm could use it. Certainly a farm could start with their household product and make their own choices about where they want to deliver the nutrients. But I would really look forward to the day when we could more efficiently bring more people into the thought that just like you used to litter, you don't litter anymore. You used to deliver your nutrients to the wastewater treatment plant, where a huge amount of time, effort, and money is being spent to waste your nutrients, essentially. And some of it goes in the lake anyway. Why would you mix your bodily nutrients with all those contaminants and put so much expense to get rid of them when, there's way better things to do with it? So, yeah, I would love to talk with farmers about how they see the opportunity of collecting it, how they see the opportunity of transforming it, if they want to, would they want to compost it and use it directly, how they see it being utilized on their farm, what opportunities do they see, how would they want to prosecute those opportunities. I'd be super down to chat with people about, is there a path to doing something useful to the small farmers in New York? I mean, I would be extremely honored to have that opportunity to chat about that with people, for sure.
Well, we're starting that conversation now. And just from my years of working at the Small Farms program, adding anything to a farmer's plate is always a really big ask. So it feels like it kind of has to come from a third party. And like, I could see farmers that I know being open to having someone come and fertilize their trees or whatever, but all of the work being done already to collect and deliver. I think people could be open to that. And there are probably other opportunities where if you sort of run like sort of a agritourism business where you have people on farm, or if you're sort of a farm wedding venue, like there's a lot of crossover things there.
Oh yeah, anything along that line makes sense to me. The winery, the cidery, anything where you have a public-facing thing, that I think that's a really good opportunity. But how to really reduce the fertilizer bill? I think that I think we could take it in steps. Like, what about the family? What about the public-facing part of the farm, if any? And then what about the kind of longer-term view where you really start to wedge out synthetic? So I think a little bit of the kind of creativity that any small farmer has, small farmers are probably the most creative people in the world because they have to be, and they wouldn't survive in the business if they weren't. So I think this kind of resourcefulness, identifying niches on their farm for value, and then circular economy is kind of always that matching that little need with that little resource, stitching things together. And that can be, as you say, burdensome. I think my sister as a farmer was trying to annihilate all the ancillary activities she could. There's just too much work to be done. But, so people are going to be making their own decisions, obviously. But if there's any way people feel like innovating around this, and I do think that event toilet kind of niche is an obvious one on a public garden space or a public facing place. If you can have a toilet for people, it's an amenity that's appreciated and is needed, more or less. And it's the cheapest thing you can do is put a bucket under a toilet seat. There you go. It's not that hard to accomplish it, in a simple and yet attractive way. I mean, I very simple, very easy, very accessible, but kind of cool looking design schemes for making
totally.
this.
Well, those were all my questions. Is there anything else you want to talk about, Rebecca?
Maybe just to reiterate my invitation to anyone who wants to chat about this. I feel like I have, some ideas to share, but a whole lot to gain from talking to small farm listeners. So I'd be super excited about having a conversation with anyone who wants to about this sort of subject. How could anything in this category work for anybody listening, either in the garden, or on the farm? I'd be real excited to chat.
Well, thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thinking back on my conversation with Rebecca, I love this idea of both the circular economies and the idea of a circular model for nutrient recovery. It just seems right to me that instead of mixing our nitrogen and phosphorus-rich urine with fresh water and all the energy that goes into processing that and pumping it into lakes, that any amount that we can divert and feed to plants is just good for the community as a whole, in terms of energy savings and hopefully in terms of productivity for local farms. As she said, this idea is still far from being scaled up. But I hope this conversation puts the idea in your head to take advantage of opportunities that may be coming down the line in the future to source cheap, eco-friendly fertilizer for your farm. I also love this idea of the circular economy. I don't think many farmers are eager to add capturing urine to their to-do list. But if there was a community partner who was doing all of that work and approached you about fertilizing your fields for free or for low cost, I hope this episode makes you more open to that idea. Rebecca is a lovely person. She's very open, as she mentioned, to people reaching out, and she's very generous with her time. So if you want to get in contact with her, you can reach us at smallfarmsprogram@cornell.edu, or if you'd prefer, you can give us a call at 607-255-4455. As always, we welcome any comments on the show, and we love hearing from you. If you liked this show, it helps us out a lot if you can comment and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. That's all for today. See you next time.